Hello, and welcome to Magalia Rose Studio. Before we go any further with today's video, I want to show you a few examples of watercolor batik. Now that you've seen some of the interesting paintings that you can create with this technique, I'm going to show you the steps I used in creating the watercolor batik painting Malkia, which means the Queen. Although totally a work of my imagination, the beginning inspiration was an advertising photo. The model's left arm was posed so imperiously that my mind began working it into my own interpretation of royalty. I have received several requests, and not to bore you, but rather to inspire you, I'm going to dwell a little bit longer on the procedures leading up to the actual painting and waxing process. As in many other creative endeavors, preparation is often one of the 90% of the work that goes into the final product. Approach the planning process as a valuable and enjoyable key to your success. Now, here's a look at the painting Malkia. Always in keeping in mind copyright protections of some photographs and definitely the protection of another artist's work, let's begin with the selection of your subject. I already mentioned my inspiration, so I began sketching a rather regal woman on 8x10 paper. Although she may appear based on ethnic or cultural photographs, the dress, jewelry, hair, etc. are purely fictional products of my imagination. Remember, as an artist, you are the ultimate Photoshop, and have some fun. When I'm satisfied with my initial drawing, I trace it onto a clean piece of paper. The original is a bit of a mess with erasures, smears, etc. I then scan the image, which is on an 8x10 approximately sized paper, onto my computer. Now I can make unlimited copies on cardstock paper to experiment with watercolor pencils and also to enlarge the sketch to the dimensions I want for the final painting. Lastly, I have a reasonably safe image preserved on the computer or disk for future use. Here's my 8x10 scan on cardstock, and I have begun to use my watercolor pencils to plan out the color patterns I want to use. The next few images will also show you the progress in doing this initial sort of a rough draft of the painting. Why this step? For me, it gives me an idea of what colors may or may not work for the effect I'm looking for. It can also prepare me for issues that might arise in creating a watercolor batik. It gives me the time to decide the order of layering down watercolor and wax, and what techniques that I have learned will best suit the painting. If you think this step is a waste of time, I hope you reconsider. This may enable the actual painting to go much more quickly and solve problems before they arise. In the previous image, you saw the completed prototype done with watercolor pencils. And after looking at it, there were several things I decided to change for the final painting. And here is the photograph of the final painting, and you can see the changes I've made if you refer back. The general palette worked for me, excepting the trim on the sleeves, which I decided will become black and phthalo blue. I will also be adding an area to indicate the drape of the dress on the lower left. And I added gold bracelets on the raised arm as I worked. So you can see sometimes pre-planning will lead to a better painting. On my computer, I take that original scan I had made, and using it a section at a time and using a cut and paste method, I enlarge my corrected image to be the size I want to fit onto the 1/2 sheet of Ginwashi paper, which measures approximately, depending on your brand, 19 inches by 25 inches. Ginwashi is a thin Japanese paper with little silver short threads running through it. You can see how transparent it is by the partial painting that's underneath 1 and 2 layers of Ginwashi. I never fold my Ginwashi, I keep it on a roll, as you can see in the forefront here. When it's dry, it's fairly strong, but once it's wet, it is much more fragile, so always be careful when handling it. It is available perhaps at a local craft store or definitely online, so if you would like to give it a try, it's very interesting paper. I then place that enlarged image under the Ginwashi and lightly tape it in the corners, and using a variety of permanent ink markers, thin for face details and slightly thicker for the rest, I trace the image onto the Ginwashi paper. I use a combination of black ultrafine Sharpies, 0.05 and 0.005 black micron pens, and you can use pencils or any variety of pens to give you the effect you desire. Just be sure they are permanent so that you will be adding watercolor and don't necessarily want that ink to bleed. I make my own support boards made to size for the half sheet and quarter sheet of Ginwashi paper, and what I use are several layers of pretty heavy cardboard that are taped together. I then cover these with plastic freezer paper as shown in the image. I use new paper every single time I make a batik to avoid transfer from previous paintings. I want to take just a moment to talk about the process of melting the wax and the types of wax I use. You can use just the generic paraffin wax that's often used for canning, which is a little more brittle, and sometimes with use you'll find out you prefer that for certain uses. You can also use commercial batik wax, which is available at local craft stores usually or online. Always use extreme care when melting the wax. Use a commercial wax melter, or in the case I use metal containers such as old tin cans, and a small electric skillet that is filled with water, at all times filled with water. This can get very hot. The temperature I use is around between 180 and 200 Fahrenheit, and it can burn you, both the water splashing or the wax. So take great care, and only experience will tell you which types of wax you prefer to use. I always prepare a large quantity of newsprint and craft paper to absorb the melting wax. I advise you to always have more paper on hand than you think you're going to need. It's critically important that you don't, once you get most of the wax removed, that you aren't stuck cutting up paper and waiting. So have more available. You'll probably use it on the next painting. Have your wax melted and ready to go. And what I do is use push pins, and I attach the Ginwashi to the support board that's been covered with that plastic coated freezer paper. Remember, your temperature is between 180 and 200 degrees. The melted wax should appear clear. And use only old brushes to apply the wax, since there's an old saying among batik artists that once a wax brush, always a wax brush. Use ventilation and great care with that hot wax. What I'm going to do is begin by applying wax to areas that are to remain white. This may be a large or small area. That'll just depend on your painting. In this particular case, I'm going to begin by applying wax to the white areas of both the eyes. I can now begin applying watercolor, but this painting I'm going to do something a little different. The woman will be wearing a black vest with bright colored areas over a red-brown shift. The problem with watercolor is that it will bleed and go into other areas. So what I'm going to do is use black ink with a brush. My favorite ink is Dr. P.H. Martin's Black Star Waterproof Black India ink. After the ink dries, I paint in the colored areas of the vest, referring to my color Proto-type sheet. While I have the ink and brush available, I also ink in the black trim on both sleeves. I cover the vest and black trim on the sleeve with wax at this time. Once the wax is set, which just takes a moment or two, I'm going to paint all the areas that will eventually be covered in gold gouache when the painting is completed. And I'm going to just paint those areas now with new gamboge, sort of to hold that area. I paint the fingernails with a very dilute burnt sienna, and the lips are also painted with a very dilute burnt sienna with a faint blush of alizarin crimson dropped in while it's still wet. The whites of the eyes are already covered with wax, and I paint the iris with burnt umber. When all those areas are completely dry, and remember, be completely dry, I cover them with melted wax. Now it's time to move on to the skin tones. I used a combination of burnt umber with a bit of burnt sienna, starting with the face and both arms. I do not paint the neck and chest until the face is painted, dried, and covered with wax, so that there is a definite definition between the face and the shadow area beneath the chin. If you've ever worked with a watercolor on Ginwashi, you will understand how much the watercolor can bleed into adjoining areas, and planning ahead is necessary. When dry, I cover the face and both arms with melted wax. In the previous image, you could see how I handled the face and neck, and they're now all waxed. I want you to now think about the fact that the arms have been waxed, and I'm going to move on to the dress. And for that, I used Quinacridone Burnt Orange. The areas next to the dress of the image are all waxed, so I don't have to worry about color bleeding into unwanted areas. Yes, it will bleed into the background, but that usually is an added plus to the process. So don't worry either about a few drops of wax on unpainted areas. That also is part of the batik process and how it's going to look when it's done. Now I paint the remaining trim on the sleeves with phthalo blue, and when all those areas are dry, I cover them completely with melted wax. Here is part of an earlier photo that you saw, showing the detail on the hair. I approached the hair with a bit of trepidation. I used my ultrafine Sharpie to indicate texture and to define the areas of the hair. When it came to painting, I used a combination of Payne's Gray and Indigo, dropping the color in sort of haphazardly, hoping for a random look. When the hair area is dry, I cover the colored areas with melted wax, sometimes leaving the areas that have bled into the background remain uncovered. I don't want too many hard lines here. Now the entire figure has been covered in wax, and it's time to move on to the background. And I've decided on an somewhat abstract background using new gamboge, quinacridone gold, deep sap green, phthalo blue, and indigo. When you're working in large areas of Ginwashi, there's no need to wet the paper first. Just be sure to have large amounts, large puddles of your chosen colors, and then just drop them in as you desire. In this painting, my direction was to create a value challenge of yellow gold around the dark hair of the figure, then darks of deep sap green and indigo toward the bottom, blending up to the phthalo blue in the upper areas. No strict demarcations were wanted, just a gentle blending. When I've completed painting, I let the background dry completely, and then I'm going to cover the entire painting with a layer of wax. I call this the cracking layer. Here is a photograph of the usual setup I use for the ironing wax removal process, even though this was another painting. Be sure that you protect the area around the ironing wax removal area with tarps, cardboard, and/or additional paper. Be sure to provide good ventilation, even if it requires a little fan set it low. Have a large trash bag or container beside this area in which you are going to throw away the wax impregnated paper. Have the area again well ventilated, and use caution as you're going to be using a very hot iron and hot melted wax. Have this area prepared before you complete the final step. And I have one more piece of advice. I always prepare a large quantity of newsprint and craft paper to absorb the melting wax. I advise you to always have more paper on hand than you think you're going to need. It's critically important that you don't, once you get most of the wax removed, that you aren't stuck cutting up paper and waiting. So have more available. You'll probably use it on the next painting. This is what the painting looks like when the entire thing is covered with that layer I call the cracking layer of wax. I do put the wax with a large brush over everything. I go over the figure and every bit of the background. Be sure everything is covered. This is extremely important because the next step involves putting a dark watercolor wash over the wax, and if you've left open areas, that dark color is just going to spread right in. Now, when the wax is cooled completely, and I sometimes will set my painting outside if it's cold, and if it isn't cold, if it's a warm day in the summer, I actually take ice packs from the freezer and lay them over the painting. A wax cracks better when cold. Go ahead, once that it feels cool to the touch, remove push pins and lift that painting from the support board. It might stick a little bit, but just stick your hand under the painting and separate it from the board. At this point, some cracking in the wax will occur, and that is the whole idea of this. In fact, I often crack the wax in additional areas with my hands because this is part of the magic of batik. No matter what your experience, no one can predict the final pattern that will emerge. So relax. Get comfortable with this bit of unpredictability and just feel that it is part of the experience and part of what you are going to learn. This is what the painting is going to look like when I apply the cracking color there that's going to bleed into the painting. In this particular case, I used a large amount of indigo mixed with phthalo blue. Before I do actually apply the wax, however, I make sure that everything is ready to iron off all the wax, because the next step involves another layer of hot wax and then a pretty reasonably quick removal of that wax. In preparation, I lay down an old towel on the counter and I cover it with several layers of cardboard, which are again covered in several layers of craft paper or old paper bags. Have an iron ready to go, set to dry, not steam, and be sure the water reservoir has been emptied, and you're going to heat that iron to cotton and or linen. Now this is important because once the final layer of wax is applied, which pushes the wash into the cracks, you don't have a whole lot of time. You don't want this to sit for a couple hours or overnight. So have everything ready to go. I'm going to follow up with a couple more steps in preparation. Here is the painting shown with the final layer of wax applied, the layer that goes over the wash and tries to get it into the cracks. You don't see the wash in this one, of course, because the wax has sort of brushed it across and into certain areas. Now it is time to remove the wax. Have it on that safe prepared location, cardboard and other heavy cardboard type materials, craft paper, etc. on the bottom, and lay the painting on the top of this. Then lay several layers of newsprint on the surface of the painting and move your heated iron slowly across the surface. You will see melted wax being absorbed by the paper. Remove and apply clean paper as necessary until most of the wax is removed. Turn the painting over and continue the process on the back. Return to the front and continue until you really don't see any more additional wax being removed. Again, be sure that you use care. That melted wax can drip. Make sure floors and areas are protected. Make sure you have a satisfactory ventilation. And now the painting has been removed from wax. You can pick it up, turn off the iron, and set the iron in a cool place to cool, and get the used papers all safely tucked away into the disposal areas you have designated. And if the painting appears dark, don't panic at this point. Set it on a piece of white mat board, and with good luck, you will see the painting actually come to life. With all of the wax removed, the Ginwashi paper is quite fragile, and I strongly recommend that you use either a spray adhesive or Yes paste to attach your painting to a sheet of white archival mat board, and I usually have it the same size as the painting. If you are using paste, please let it dry flat in a safe location overnight. Now once you have your painting mounted and it is dry, you can do some extra details. For example, I use gold gouache to highlight the jewelry where I've desired that to be. And at this point, the painting is completely ready to frame. I usually frame my watercolor batik paintings in the same manner as I frame any of my watercolor paintings, matted and under glass. This is a personal preference, and you'll decide just how you want to present your batik paintings. And now let's take a look at the final work. Here's the final painting, and I'm pretty pleased at how it turned out. I learned a few things, and a few things didn't go quite exactly as I had planned, but that is part of just learning how to go with the process. I hope you've enjoyed the demonstration of how this watercolor batik was created, and subscribe to my channel, Magalia Rose Studio, to receive notices of future demonstrations. Until then, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.